Two prime ministers were sitting in a room discussing affairs of state. Suddenly a man bursts in, apoplectic with fury, shouting and stamping and banging his fist on the desk. The resident prime minister admonishes him. Peter, he says, kindly remember rule number 6. Whereupon Peter is instantly restored to complete calm, apologizes, and withdraws. The politicians return to their conversation, only to be interrupted yet again 20 minutes later by a hysterical woman gesticulating wildly, her hair flying. Again, the intruder is greeted with the words, "Mary, please remember rule number 6. Complete calm descends once more, and she too withdraws with a bow and an apology. When the scene is repeated for a third time, the visiting prime minister addresses his colleague, "My dear friend, I've seen many things in my life, but never anything as remarkable as this. Would you be willing to share with me the secret of this rule number 6? Very simple, replies the resident prime minister. Rule number 6 is don't take yourself so seriously. Ah, says his visitor. That is a fine rule. After a moment of pondering, he inquires, and what, may I ask, are the other rules? There aren't any. Once in a while, I think we all need to be reminded of rule number 6, especially when we are upset about something, anything that does not go the way we imagined it should be. Now, the reason why I have chosen to start my reflection with this joke is that it might shed some light on the essence of today's gospel. The rule number 1 of our Christian life, called the Great Commandment. The Pharisees and Sadducees, as we heard, who are the religious leaders of Judaism at that time, were bothering Jesus for quite some time with all kinds of questions. And today's passage comes as a culmination of a series of challenges to this young rabbi called Jesus. Here, one of the adversaries of Jesus asks, what is the greatest commandment? Thinking and perhaps hoping too that Jesus would be puzzled by this. And maybe he would rather avoid the question altogether, because any attempt to categorize in a hierarchical fashion either the 10 Commandments or the 613 commandments of the Jewish Torah that was supposed to be an interpretation and implementation of the 10 Commandments. So any attempt to pick and choose from these could look like as if one would be putting oneself above the law and maybe even above God himself. Jesus, however, did not hesitate for a minute and told them that he thinks the greatest commandment was loving the Eternal One above all, with all you've got, and also loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, one of these commandments comes literally from the book of Deuteronomy, and the other from Leviticus, both of them from the Old Testament. And then Jesus asked his challengers a question regarding the identity of the promised Messiah, which means the anointed one who had been foretold by the prophets, who will come and save the people of Israel and all God's people. When the challengers of Jesus answered that the Messiah, or the Christ, in its Greek version, that is the anointed one, will be the descendant of David, Jesus left them with a puzzling question. If the Messiah, this Christ, the anointed one, is the son of David, that is the descendant, then why was David referring to him as his Lord, who has been offered to sit at the right hand of the Lord Almighty. Thus, who seem to be equal in glory and majesty to God. That's what sitting on the right hand means. So he's not so much equal only to David the king, but equal to God. Now, of course, the pious adversaries of Jesus were not able to solve this puzzle, since they did not believe that Jesus was the promised Messiah. So the case was closed, for now at least, and they left him alone until the time of the Holy Week, when we know what happened. Now, anyone familiar with the BCP service would be also familiar with the reciting of the Great Commandments at each Holy Communion, unless the priest would choose the alternative of reciting the Ten Commandments, which almost never happens. One wonders why, may wonder why. But also anyone who grew up going to church regularly in any denomination or any congregation will have heard about the great commandment of loving God above all and loving our neighbors. The overall familiarity with the sacred text, though, might lead one to simply gloss over some of the details or the deeper meanings that might be waiting to be discovered. It was about 2 decades ago when I started paying closer attention to the words of the Great Commandment and became more and more mindful of the context. And with the help of the wise spiritual guides, I was able to discover that Jesus' summary of all the divine commandments was something much more than a brilliant summary. This great commandment, as it is presented by Jesus, was something that was a mirror of his own personal life and the ground principle by which he lived. You see, the greatest difference between us as human beings and Jesus as another human being is perhaps that while Jesus was able to live continuously and consistently according to the law of loving God above all and loving the neighbors as himself, none of us here present, that is, none of the honest followers of Jesus, ever could say the same thing about themselves. That they are doing this all the time without exception. And because Jesus of Nazareth is the human embodiment of the great commandment of loving God above all and neighbors as oneself, he was able to say to his followers at the Last Supper without any restriction or hesitation, "Love each other as I have loved you." Most of us, most of the time, are even struggling to grasp the very meaning of this commandment. After all, what does it mean to love God or someone who might be a stranger, let alone to shape our lives accordingly and consistently in the spirit of this great biblical principle embodied by Jesus? We may know the words of the great commandment by heart, but we may have no idea where to start implementing this rule number 1, which we see clearly illustrated and exemplified in and through the person of Jesus. Now, the hardest part, of course, is not knowing the words of this divine rule of life. The hardest part is understanding the deeper meaning of these words and putting them into practice to the best of our abilities, and doing this day by day. Understanding is important, according to Jesus, since it is interesting to note that Jesus has somewhat modified the text from Deuteronomy, where it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might," or strength. This last word, Jesus simply replaced or rather added another dimension to it by emphasizing the mind, with which we can also love, that is, devote ourselves to God. At the moment we start asking ourselves, what does it mean exactly for us in the here and now, in our own life circumstances, to love God with all we've got, with the whole of our heart, soul, and mind? We might be surprised and puzzled to find out that eventually this might turn out to be an impossible task to accomplish. Because how would we be able to love the one whom we don't see with our physical eyes, and the one whom we cannot even hear with our physical ears, the great I Am, who has been revealed to Moses as the I am who I am? So how can we love this God whom we cannot see face to face, whom we cannot experience by touching or embracing him like we do with other human beings? How could we love this invisible God with all of our hearts, all of our souls, all of our minds, and with all of our strength? Let me put this a little bit differently. How do we know, or when do we know, if we are loving God with all of our hearts, all of our souls, all of our minds? Since this whole thing could be only the figment of our imagination or a mere wishful thinking that we do that. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we do need to come to church regularly or once in a while. Namely, in order to put to the test our belief, according to which we might be convinced that we are loving God with all we've got. And at least in our intention, we love our neighbors as ourselves too. If you want to know if this is the case, all you have to do is come to church and see if your spiritual self-image checks out or not. Case closed. I personally am convinced that only the giver of life, in whom we live and move and have our being, only the Spirit of the Eternal One can enable us to even imagine, let alone aspire, to love God with all we've got. Without God's help, it won't work. If we would surrender to this divine desire welling up in our hearts, minds, and at the bottom of our souls, then the one who saves, Yeshua, the human embodiment of divine love, comes to our help and would show us the way how to put our love into practice. And whenever we would fail in loving God with all we've got, Jesus the Christ would remind us to start again and again and again. So to grow in our relationship with the one who is the ground of our being. As for the second part of the Great Commandment, I think that only God can enable us to love the other person as ourself. And Jesus showed us how the living out of this part of commandment looked like, especially when he offered his compassion to everyone he met, even to his adversaries, and gave his whole life as a ransom for even those who hated him and actually killed him on the cross. Side note, I realized this not so long ago, that Jesus never said to love our neighbor as much as ourselves. But rather he said this: love your neighbor as yourself. Which I take to mean love the other person you meet as a part of your own self or life. This way of understanding, though, makes it clear that loving one's neighbor as oneself is not a matter of quantity, but rather a matter of intention. And a change of one's mind in thinking is needed to think about the other persons, conceiving them, anyone whom we meet, not as alien objects who would be totally separate from us and from our lives, but rather those who are part of who we are in the universal web of human life. For sure, each and every one of us here needs a reminder at least once a week to recall what is the foundation of our Christian faith. And if we turn to Jesus, he will always remind us of rule number 1. That is loving God above all and with all we've got, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. So let us keep remembering this most basic rule and principle of our spiritual life in Christ, and let us ponder about its concrete meaning and implication for our lives, in our life circumstances, as we intend to follow Jesus the Christ in the path of divine and human love, step by step, day by day, starting afresh every day.